The pit. The pit boiled with shadows. The wet, rancid odor that floated up told her that corpses lined its bottom. Her knees sunk into cold mud, shoulders aching, arms cinched tight. Maya shivered from cold and fear. Broken teeth clenched on the rag stuffed in her mouth, shoving her tongue so far back it felt like choking. A gun pressed into the back of her head, right where her neck ended. It was beyond a time of begging. Nothing moved in the sandy flats, only dark-bottomed cumulus clouds that rolled eastward. A radio somewhere played Motorhead. A chained pit bull barked. Thunder rumbled, echoing off the mountains. The wind from the storm blew through the valley, tousling the remaining lock of hair on her scalped head. Blood trickled into her eyes. Maya interacted with the world through a hard lens of pain. Above her, the labored breath of an overweight man sawed in and out. He wasn't the one who raped her. Didn't smell like him. This one smelled of piss and soured beer. An underling, a nobody mess cleaner. Maya closed her eyes, hoping he wasn't so drunk that he botched the job. After everything, the thought of dying in the pit was agony enough. Pain was her constant companion, her body barely functioning. The man pulled the barrel from her head, rubbing it along her cheek. He murmured words she couldn't quite make out, whether it was a prayer or some sort of drunken gibberish. She grunted behind the rag, psyching herself for the coming bullet. Death compared to the searing pain of her exposed skull bone or the abused burning place between her legs was nothing. She craved it. She screamed behind the rag until her body shook. The gun pulled away and the wind rushed to fill the space. Lightning flashed, arcing across the edges of the mountains in a cold electric fire. An intrusive thought of beauty pierced her mind, the unspeakable beauty of those blood mountains. Thunder clapped, rolling across the sky. The bullet exploded into her. Maya's eyes went wide. Her body jerked forward. She ricocheted, folding, and then somersaulted down into the pit. The world spun. Maya wavered on the edge of consciousness, her body rolling through the mud until she rested atop, crackling fragile bones and disintegrating flesh. The smell of rot, piss, and shit permeated the moist air. Everything went black, and then came back into blood-fogged focus. A skull lay near her head, its jaws open in a final scream. Maya cried out, gagging around the rag, her lower abdomen warm and wet burned. She tried to move her chin forward, tipping it enough to see the hole blown in her lower belly. She moaned, unable to breathe, nostrils flaring. She couldn't see much in the dim light, except the shadowy shapes of bodies in different stages of decay. She tried to shove her feet into the dirt, but only felt crunching bones and the sick pop of skin. The action took all her strength and amounted to nothing. The rain started to fall again. She felt the drops pummeling her skin and the bodies that lined the bottom. Fuzzy fingers of sleep or death pulled her back into the dark. Consciousness returned with a flood of horror. The rag in her mouth was swollen with rancid water. She tried to cough but couldn't. Desperately, she worked her tongue along the side of her inner cheek, eventually making enough room to force the wet rag out. She coughed hard, bending into her knees, the action triggering knives of pain through her midsection. She moaned, biting her lip to keep the sound from traveling upward. Maya scooted, bracing one foot enough to tip her face out of the fleshy soup of the pit. Scanning the edges, she didn't see the man. Her eyes dropped and then flicked back to her belly. There would be no way to scale the 15-foot sides with her arms tied behind her and her guts falling out. Pain washed over her in radiating waves as she whispered platitudes for death. Something hissed from the far side of the pit. Bones clapped together, a rattling sound, and scraping bubbling up from the muck. Bones were pulled under and then popped back up. As it passed, whatever it was seemed to be making its way to her. More clinking of disturbed bones and the sick slap of putrid flesh, followed by silence. Maya tried to move, but her body did not respond. In the dark, a hiss followed a sigh. The skull nearest her face tipped, disturbed by something she couldn't see. Anything could have fallen in or made a home among the steady food supply of bodies and debris, but whatever it was seemed bigger than a snake. She felt something smooth curl around her bare foot, warmer than the rain-chilled slop. Maya moaned as it swirled around her toes. A slick, tubular body wound around her calves, gliding up her inner thighs. She pushed her foot into the mud, shaking her shoulders, attempting to move numb fingers constrained in the bindings, submerged in cold water. The thing glimmered each time it broke the surface, slithering around her thighs and hips. The full moon tore through the clouds, adding to the scant starlight. Maya's vision rolled over the gaping hole in her gut and the serpentine shape of her intestines and the thing that slid over her legs. Corpses of those thrown here days or more reached out with claw-like fingers and stiff limbs with skin webbed over bone that shone gray-white under the moonlight. Maya couldn't comprehend and even wondered if she had died and arrived in hell payment for her sins. The thing continued to slither, rolling over and under her legs. Maya tried to move, but the numbness of tiptoeing death pressed her into paralysis. Breathing was painful, like spider webs of glass stabbing into her core. She hovered in a twilight place, slipping to a numb apathy. She sucked in breath that hitched on her diaphragm, causing painful hiccups, making it even harder to breathe. The thing stopped its revolutions, and Maya watched as it lay still for a moment across her legs, her vision tunneling. Its body lurched, lifting a head she had not seen. There were no eyes, only a substantial circular maw full of row upon row of tiny teeth. Its movement glitched in her dying vision as it propelled its body into her abdomen and dove into her gaping wound. Maya cried out, feeling its teeth as it tunneled into her body, expanding into her limbs, the mouth biting through her chest cavity, winding its way around her spine and grinding its way upward into her brain. Her eyes rolled as electric sparks zigzagged through her in scraping claws of pain. Darkness did not come, nor the death she expected within the grinding maw of the thing. Maya felt long tendrils exploring her inner body, tunneling and then pulling and tightening into knots as the thing drilled into her brain in blinding mastication. Maya dimmed, floating in black ink. Her soul shivered in a dark place. Fingers now unzipped her flesh, pulling apart the outer epidermis. Nightmare spun into darkness, the edges undulating, gnashing bloody teeth. Emptiness twisted her guts. Something pulled on long loops of her intestines, pulling them until they snapped. She didn't die. She fell. A red velvet body violently pulled apart. She awoke, her arms free and flung out to the sides. Her right hand clenched through the eye sockets of a jaw of a fleshy skull. Hunger stirred in her stomach, and a need to eat fired in her brain. Her body felt whole, the pain strangely expunged from her limbs and gut. Testing her body, she sat up, crouching in the putrid muck. Hand sweeping across her miraculously healed belly, she reached fingers to her head, finding it smooth with new soft skin. The single lock still falling to her breast. Her stomach growled loudly. Hunger clawed at her guts. She looked up the sides of the pit, realizing that she could see clearly in the dark. She thought about climbing out, and suddenly her body was propelled in motion, gripping the crumbling dirt with fingers and toes, launching herself over the lip with ease. The condemned-looking adobe house was dark, an old Toyota pickup parked outside. She glanced to where she remembered the grizzled pit bull and saw that it slept chained to the side of the house. She remembered the smell of piss and beer as it wafted from the house, and she knew the man was asleep inside. Her stomach screamed in hunger, causing a slight ache to infuse her joints. Maya walked ghost-like towards the house. The silence was interrupted by a low growl. The dog had awoken to sense that something was not right. Maya didn't think. Her mind suddenly flooded with hunger. The dog launched itself at her, the chain clinking and then snapping as the dog reached its entire length. She jumped, wrapped her hands around the animal, feeling its tight muscles and starved form. Its teeth snapped, biting at her neck. She felt the jaws lock, sinking in the muscle. The hunger was overwhelming, pushing pain to the side as her mouth opened and her teeth bit hard into the animal. Blood spurted into her mouth in a thumping gush, driving her into a frenzy. She smiled, and she pulled tight on the squirming animal, ignoring its growling behind clenched teeth as it slowed into a whimper, the body growing limp in her arms. "What the fuck?" A man's voice shouted from inside the house. A light flared up in the dark recesses. Something crashed inside, and the front door was torn open. A man peered into the darkness, blinded by the sun illumination. He went back inside and then returned, flicking on a flashlight next to the barrel of a Glock 19. The light fell upon Maya's face. Slowly, she lowered the carcass from her lips. She felt the warm blood dripping from her chin. A flash split the night sky. Maya heard bullets sing past her head. She smiled, dropping the dog to the ground, her hunger only slightly sated. "Chupacabra!" the man screamed, pulling the trigger again and again, the barrel of the gun sparking in the dark. Maya moved with speed she didn't understand. It seemed she thought of her mouth at his throat, and it was. Her arms wrapped around his thick, sweaty neck, her nails digging into the meat, teeth sinking deep into veins. The man thrashed, firing off shots from drooping arms, until his hand released the gun. His blood flooded her mouth, the flesh salty as she chewed. He jerked, trying to remove her hold, but she wrapped her legs tight around him as he sunk to the sandy ground. She fed like an infant at the breast until the sun rose over the Sangre de Cristos. Thank you. My name is Brenda S.Tolian, and this was the beginning of a new novel called The Pit.